It was a cold, foggy evening when I first heard about the Winchester Mystery House. I had always been intrigued by strange stories and haunted places, but this one was different. It wasn't just any old haunted mansion. This was a place with an unsettling history, built by a woman driven to madness by grief and guilt. It was said to be cursed, a labyrinth of hallways, stairs that led nowhere, and doors that opened into walls. The more I learned about the place, the more I felt compelled to see it for myself. The story of Sarah Winchester, the widow of the inventor of the famous rifle, fascinated me. She had inherited a fortune after her husband's death, but she also inherited the guilt of all those who had been killed by the rifle. The legend went that she visited a medium who told her that the spirits of those killed by the rifle were angry and would seek revenge on her unless she built a house that would keep them at bay. She was told to build it continuously, day and night, without stopping, to appease the spirits. So she did. For 38 years. Sarah Winchester oversaw the construction of what would become the Winchester Mystery House, a sprawling mansion in San Jose, California, full of strange, confusing architecture. I knew I had to see it. I needed to understand what drove her to create something so bizarre, so unsettling. What had she believed she was protecting herself from? And why did she keep building, even as the house became more and more nonsensical? I arrived at the mansion on a rainy afternoon. The mist hung thick in the air and the house loomed in front of me, massive and imposing. It wasn't just a house, it was a maze, a puzzle that seemed to defy logic. As I walked through the front gates, I was immediately struck by the size of the place. The mansion didn't look like any house I had ever seen. It was a hodgepodge of architectural styles with random windows and doors placed in strange positions. Stairs led to nowhere, and hallways twisted and turned in confusing directions. Every room seemed to hold more secrets than the last. I took the tour, walking through the winding halls, feeling like I was being swallowed by the house itself. The guide explained the peculiarities of the house, the doors that opened into walls, the stairs that went up only a few steps before abruptly stopping. Some rooms were small, cramped, while others were grand, with intricate woodwork and elaborate chandeliers. But the strangest part was the sense of isolation I felt as I wandered through the rooms. Despite the other people on the tour, it felt like I was the only one there. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. As I moved deeper into the house, I began to feel a strange chill. It wasn't just the cold air, it was something else, something that made my skin crawl. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the house was alive, like it was watching me. There were times when I would look down a hallway and feel like someone or something was just around the corner waiting for me. The hairs on the back of my neck would stand up, and my heart would race, but when I turned the corner, there was nothing there. I found myself drawn to the basement. It was small, with low ceilings and narrow, winding steps that led down into darkness. The air down there was thick, heavy with the scent of dust and age. There was an odd sense of claustrophobia in the basement, as though the walls were closing in on me. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as I descended into the depths of the house. The guide had mentioned that the basement had been one of the first parts of the house to be built, and that Sarah Winchester had spent a lot of time there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something not quite right. As I walked deeper into the basement, I stumbled across an old iron door. It was slightly ajar, and a faint, musty odor wafted out from the crack. My curiosity got the best of me, and I pushed the door open. Inside, I found nothing but cobwebs and old, dusty furniture. But what caught my attention was a large, ornate mirror on the far wall. It was framed in gold, and it had an odd, almost hypnotic quality to it. I stood in front of the mirror for a long time, staring at my reflection, but something felt off. The reflection didn't seem quite right. It was as if the image in the mirror was moving, shifting, changing in subtle ways. I stepped back, my heart pounding, and quickly left the basement. I didn't want to stay there any longer. The house felt different now, heavier, darker. It was as though something had been awakened. The tour continued, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I felt like I was being followed, like eyes were on me, though when I looked around there was no one there. The feeling persisted as we made our way through the rest of the mansion, growing stronger with every step. Finally, we reached the top floor of the house. The roof was unfinished, just a series of open beams and empty space. The view from up there was breathtaking, but as I stood on the edge, looking out over the mist-covered grounds, I couldn't help but feel a deep unease. I thought about Sarah Winchester standing here, alone, perhaps late at night, staring out into the darkness, convinced that the spirits of the dead were watching her, waiting for her to finish the house. When the tour ended, I walked out of the mansion, my mind spinning. There was something about the house that didn't sit right with me. Something I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the strange architecture or the unsettling feeling I had walking through the rooms. It was the sense that the house was alive, that it held some dark secret, something that Sarah Winchester had known but had never shared. As I left the grounds, I glanced back at the house one last time. It stood there, imposing, shrouded in fog, as though it had absorbed all of the pain and grief that had been poured into it over the years. To this day, I can't explain the feeling I had in the Winchester Mystery House. Was it the energy of the spirits that Sarah Winchester had tried to keep at bay? Or was it the lingering presence of her own madness, her guilt, and her grief? Whatever it was, it stayed with me long after I left. It was a reminder that some places hold their secrets, and no matter how much you try to understand them, there are some things that should remain unknown. I had always been drawn to the mysterious and the eerie, so when I first heard about the Villisca axe murders, I couldn't resist. The idea that a brutal crime could have occurred so quietly, without any clear explanation or resolution, hooked me immediately. I had always been a fan of true crime stories, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about the crime itself, but the unsettling, lingering energy that seemed to cling to the house where it happened. So I decided to make the trip to Villisca myself, to see the place where it all went down, to experience the atmosphere for myself. The town of Villisca was small and quiet, just as I'd imagined. Nothing about it screamed horror or mystery at first glance, until you reached the house. Nestled in the middle of a tree-lined street, the white frame house stood as a grim reminder of the horrors that occurred there over a century ago. It was like the house itself was stuck in time, frozen in the moment of the murders, unable to move forward. As I stepped inside, I felt a strange shift in the air, a sense that something wasn't quite right. The air was thick, heavy, and almost oppressive, like the house was holding onto its dark past with a vice-like grip. Walking through the rooms, I could feel the eerie presence of those who had died here. The furniture was old and worn, the pictures on the walls faded with age, but it was the silence that struck me the hardest. There was no noise, no creaking of the floors, no breeze through the windows, just stillness. The kind of stillness that feels unnatural, as if time has stopped, as if the house itself is holding its breath. The whole place felt frozen in time, as though the spirits of the Moore family and their two young guests still haunted the rooms, unwilling or unable to leave. I made my way up the stairs to the second floor, where the murders had taken place. The rooms seemed so normal at first, but as I stood there, the weight of what had happened here began to sink in. Josiah and Sarah Moore's room was at the front of the house, and I could almost picture them lying there in their bed, completely unaware of the terror that was about to unfold. The children's rooms were at the back, and just down the hall were the rooms where the Stillinger girls had been staying. I couldn't help but imagine how it must have felt for them, the terror, the confusion, as someone crept into their rooms and struck them down while they slept. so silently, so efficiently. There was no struggle, no sign of a fight, just the cold, brutal efficiency of a killer who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. The worst part, I realized, was that no one had ever really been able to make sense of it. The police had no leads, no suspects, no clear motive. The house had been locked from the inside with no sign of forced entry. The killer had been inside probably for hours and had left without a trace. There were theories, of course. Some believed it was someone who knew the family, someone who had a personal grudge against them. Others thought it might have been a random act, a senseless, opportunistic crime. But after all these years, no one had ever been able to figure out who had done it or why. As I stood in the house, I felt an odd mix of curiosity and dread. The place seemed to be filled with a kind of energy, something I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the weight of the crime that lingered in the air, but something else, something darker. I couldn't help but wonder if the house itself was haunted, if the spirits of the victims still walked these rooms, unable to find peace. I made my way through the rest of the house, each room feeling more oppressive than the last. In the kitchen, I stopped and looked around, picturing the Moore family's daily life before the murders. How had they lived? What were their lives like? It was hard to reconcile the image of a family living their everyday life here with the horror that had unfolded only a few short years later. And then there was the axe. I couldn't help but feel a chill when I laid eyes on it, the weapon that had taken so many lives. It was displayed in a glass case, though no one knew for sure if it was the actual weapon used in the murders. The mystery surrounding it only added to the sense of unease that hung over the house. As I left, the weight of the experience stayed with me. The house had felt heavy, suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been in the presence of something beyond the physical world. Some mysteries, it seemed, were never meant to be solved, and the Villisca Axe murder house, with its dark past and unanswered questions, was one of those mysteries. Now, whenever I think back to that day, I can't help but wonder, what happened in that house? Who committed those murders and why? The answers still elude us, but the haunting presence of the house and the dark energy that seems to cling to it are impossible to ignore. The Villisca Axe murders remain one of the most chilling unsolved crimes in American history, and as long as the house stands, its dark history will continue to cast a long shadow. It was in the winter of 1959 when I, along with 8 of my fellow hikers, decided to embark on what we all assumed would be a thrilling adventure. I was a 23-year-old student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, and my passion for the outdoors led me to organize this trek through the harsh, snow-covered terrain of the Ural Mountains. Little did I know, this journey would mark the beginning of a mystery so chilling that it would send shivers through the world for decades to come. The air in the Ural Mountains was sharp and cold as we set off from the city, our spirits high, our backpacks packed with essentials, and our determination unwavering. We were a group of experienced hikers. Each one of us had conquered difficult terrains before, but the Dyatlov Pass, the location we had chosen for this winter expedition, would test us like no other. We were supposed to head towards Otorten Mountain, a remote, rugged peak that was known to locals, but little else. It was a place far removed from civilization, untouched by the footprints of casual tourists. That was part of the appeal, the sense of isolation and the raw beauty of nature, all to ourselves. I remember the excitement as we made our way up the snow-covered slopes, the crunch of our boots in the thick snow, and the occasional laughter that filled the crisp air. The feeling of camaraderie was strong, and I felt an unshakable connection to my companions, those who had become more than just classmates, but true friends, ready to face whatever challenges the wilderness threw at us. But as we climbed higher and the days grew colder, something shifted. The path, once clear and navigable, became obscured by a heavy snowstorm that struck with surprising ferocity. The blizzard seemed to appear out of nowhere, fierce winds whipping across the slopes, clouding our vision and making it nearly impossible to see anything more than a few feet in front of us. Despite the increasing difficulty, I knew we had to keep going. We had made it this far, and turning back wasn't an option. We pressed on, trying to maintain our composure and navigate through the whiteout until eventually we reached a point on the mountain that felt strange. I can't explain it exactly, but there was something unsettling about the way the wind howled through the trees, the way the landscape seemed to stretch out endlessly, giving me the impression that we were not alone. We set up camp for the night just below the summit of the mountain, exhausted but determined. I remember feeling the weight of the cold creeping into my bones, but it wasn't the cold that made my heart race. It was the feeling that something was wrong. Something was watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. That night, as we huddled inside our tents, we heard the faint sound of something moving through the snow. It was soft at first, just a brush against the wind, but it grew louder. Then there was a scream. Not a human scream, but something animalistic, guttural. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. We stared at each other, unsure of what to do. No one spoke, but we all shared the same unease. I insisted we stay put until morning, but some of the others wanted to investigate to know what it was that had made that noise. There was tension in the air as we debated, the storm outside raging more violently, as if adding its own sense of urgency to the situation. Finally, we decided to venture out despite my reservations. The wind had died down a little, but the snow was deep and treacherous. As we stepped outside, the scene before us was eerily still. No movement, no sounds, except for the occasional hiss of wind and the crunch of our boots in the thick snow. We scanned the area, looking for any signs of the disturbance that had startled us, but nothing seemed out of place. The cold made it difficult to focus. My fingers and toes were numb and my face felt like it had frozen, but still I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was an unnatural quiet, as though the whole world had gone mute. We returned to camp, trying to convince ourselves it was nothing more than the storm playing tricks on us. But sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in my sleeping bag, eyes wide open, listening to the sounds of the wilderness, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep, my dreams filled with vague, haunting images of figures watching from the shadows of the trees. The next day we packed up and continued our trek. The storm had passed, but the weather was still treacherous. The snow was deep, the winds unforgiving, and the path ahead was unclear. We had planned to reach the summit, but we knew we would have to be cautious. With each step, I felt the weight of the mountain pressing down on us, the danger mounting. As the day wore on, we grew more and more fatigued. The weather had taken its toll on us, and we had to make the difficult decision to turn back. Our goal of reaching the summit was no longer feasible, and we began to make our way down the mountain. But what should have been a simple retreat soon turned into a nightmare. It was late afternoon when we made camp again, this time at a lower elevation. We were all exhausted, barely able to keep our eyes open. And yet, there was still something lurking in the air, something I couldn't explain. I tried to shake off the unease, but it clung to me, tightening with each passing hour. That night, as we sat huddled in the warmth of our tents, the strange occurrences began again. The distant howls of the storm, the rustling of something moving just beyond our sight, and the faint feeling of being watched. We couldn't ignore it any longer. It was too much, too strange. We decided we would leave at dawn and head back to civilization as quickly as possible. But before we could leave, we were confronted with the truth. The nightmare had already begun. One by one, we started to realize that our survival was in jeopardy. Our tracks, which had been clearly marked in the fresh snow, had inexplicably disappeared. The wind had shifted and the snow had covered our trail. We were lost. We spent hours searching for a way out, but the landscape seemed to shift and change, as if the mountain itself was shifting beneath us. The cold grew more unbearable, and our strength was drained. Our once optimistic group became a frantic collection of individuals, struggling to stay alive in the harsh, unforgiving environment. And then the disappearances began. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't like in the movies where one minute someone's there and the next they're gone. It was subtle, small things at first. A companion who went out to check something never returned. A call into the night, met only by silence. We couldn't explain it, but we knew something was wrong. As the hours passed, the group fractured. People became disoriented, desperate. The cold and fear made us do things we would never have considered before. In the end, it wasn't the storm that killed us. It wasn't the mountain itself, it was something far darker, something I still can't put into words. It wasn't until days later, when the search and rescue teams finally found us, scattered across the mountain, that the full horror of our fate was revealed. The autopsy report stated that several of us had died from hypothermia, but others had more unsettling injuries. Some of us had broken bones, but no clear explanation for how they happened. One of us had even been found without eyes and another without a tongue. The mystery only deepened with the discovery of bizarre marks on our bodies, signs that we hadn't been alone. The Dyatlov Pass incident has never been solved. The theories are endless, from an avalanche to secret military testing to the supernatural. But in my heart, I know the truth is something darker, something far more terrifying than anyone could imagine. Something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. As I sit here today, the only one left to tell the tale, I can still feel the cold, the terror, and the whisper of the unseen forces that stalked us that night. And as I tell this story, I can only hope that others will learn from our fate. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, and some places are meant to be left untouched. The coastal village of Ravenshore had always been shrouded in mystery. Perched on jagged cliffs overlooking a churning sea, it was a place where the fog rarely lifted, and whispers of old legends clung to the air like the salt spray from the ocean. I hadn't been back to Ravenshore in over a decade, not since my parents passed away in a car accident that left me orphaned at 14. My Aunt Evelyn had taken me in and whisked me away to a bustling city far from the eerie isolation of the village. I didn't miss it, at least. I told myself I didn't. But now, 12 years later, I found myself driving along the winding road that led back to the village. Evelyn had passed away recently, and among her belongings I'd found a letter addressed to me in my mother's handwriting. Amelia, if you're reading this, it means I didn't have the chance to tell you the truth. Go back to Ravenshore, find the lighthouse. You need to understand who you really are. The lighthouse. My mother had always told me to stay away from it. It stood on a craggy peninsula, its beam cutting through the mist like a knife. People in the village said it was cursed, that strange things happened there. As a child, I had believed them, and even as an adult, the thought of it made my skin prickle. By the time I reached Ravenshore, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the sea. The village was just as I remembered, small, quiet, and unsettling. I checked into the only inn, a quaint place run by an older couple who eyed me curiously but said nothing. "Here for long?" the woman asked as she handed me a key. "No, just passing through," I said, though we both knew it wasn't true. The room was small but comfortable, with a window that overlooked the cliffs. That night I lay awake, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks filling the silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning I set out for the lighthouse. The path was overgrown, and the closer I got, the thicker the fog became. By the time I reached it, the massive structure loomed out of the mist like a ghost. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of salt and mildew. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books, old maps, and nautical instruments. A spiral staircase wound its way up to the top. I hesitated before climbing it, each step creaking beneath my weight. At the top, I found a small room with a large, dusty lens that once guided ships to safety. A single chair sat in the corner, and on the floor beside it was a leather-bound journal. I picked it up and opened it, my heart racing as I read the first entry. Amelia, if you found this, it means you're ready to know the truth. Our family has guarded the lighthouse for generations. But it's not just a beacon for ships, it's a gateway, and now it's your turn to protect it. The entries that followed told a story I could hardly believe. The lighthouse had been built to contain something ancient and powerful, something that existed in the space between worlds. My ancestors had discovered it centuries ago and had taken it upon themselves to keep it sealed. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. A faint humming noise filled the room, and I turned to see the lens glowing faintly. As I approached it, the light grew brighter, and the air around me seemed to ripple. Before I could react, the room was filled with a blinding flash, and I felt myself being pulled forward. When the light faded, I was no longer in the lighthouse. I stood on a rocky shore under a sky that pulsed with unnatural colors. The sea before me was black and shimmering, and towering figures moved in the distance, their forms indistinct but terrifying. A voice echoed in my mind, deep and resonant. "You are the guardian now, Amelia. You must keep the gateway closed." "I don't understand," I shouted, but the voice was gone. Suddenly, the ground beneath me trembled, and a massive creature rose from the sea. Its many eyes glowed with an eerie light, and its gaping maw emitted a sound that made my ears ring. I turned and ran, the landscape shifting and twisting around me. The journal was still in my hands, and as I flipped through it, I found instructions, a ritual to seal the gateway. The next hours were a blur of terror and determination as I followed the steps, chanting words I didn't understand and drawing symbols in the sand. The creature loomed closer, its massive form blocking out the strange sky. As I finished the ritual, a beam of light shot from the ground, and the creature let out a deafening roar. The world around me dissolved into blinding white, and I felt myself being pulled backward. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the lighthouse, the journal clutched tightly to my chest. The lens was dark, and the room was silent. I don't know how long I sat there, trembling and trying to make sense of what had happened, but one thing was clear: I couldn't leave. The gateway was my responsibility now, and I would do whatever it took to keep it sealed. The town of Ashfall wasn't much to look at. It clung to the edge of a vast pine-covered mountain range, the kind of place people either forgot about or only passed through on their way to somewhere else. I wouldn't have given it a second thought if it hadn't been for the letter. It had arrived 2 weeks earlier, addressed to me in a neat, unfamiliar script. I didn't recognize the sender's name, Eliza Granger, but the contents were unsettling enough to catch my attention. "Come to Ashfall. The truth about your family is here, waiting. It's time you knew." That was it. No signature, no explanation. I dismissed it as a prank at first, but something about the letter nagged at me. Maybe it was the odd familiarity of the handwriting, or the fact that my mother, who had passed away years ago, had been notoriously secretive about her past. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to go. So there I was, driving my old sedan through winding mountain roads, the trees thick and dark around me. A storm was brewing. The wind whipped leaves across the cracked asphalt, and the sky was a dull gray. I arrived in Ashfall just as the first drops of rain began to fall, pulling into a small bed and breakfast near the edge of town. The owner, an older woman with sharp eyes, handed me a key with a wary smile. "Visiting family?" she asked. "Sort of," I said, unsure of how else to explain it. Her smile faltered, and she gave me a strange look. "Be careful," she said quietly before walking away. The room was simple but cozy, with a view of the forest. As I unpacked, I unfolded the letter again, tracing the handwriting. I had no idea who Eliza Granger was or why she'd contacted me, but I intended to find out. The next morning, I started asking around. The town was small enough that most people knew each other, but no one seemed to recognize Eliza's name. Their reactions, though, were telling. At the mention of her name, people would tense, their smiles would fade, and they'd quickly change the subject. Finally, a man at the general store leaned in close and whispered, "If you're looking for Eliza, you should try the old Granger house. It's up on the hill, past the cemetery, but you might not like what you find." The Granger house was easy to spot, a crumbling Victorian at the edge of the woods, its windows boarded up and its yard overgrown. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. I pushed open the rusted gate, the creak echoing in the still air, and made my way up the weed-choked path. The front door was ajar, and I hesitated before stepping inside. The interior was worse than the outside. Dust coated every surface, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. The furniture was still there, but it was warped and broken, as though the house had been frozen in time. "Eliza," I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I wandered through the rooms, my footsteps stirring up clouds of dust. The walls were covered in old photographs, but many of them had been slashed or burned, leaving only fragments of faces and landscapes. In the living room, I found a faded family portrait hanging above the fireplace. A woman, a man, and a little girl. The woman's face was eerily familiar, and my stomach twisted as I realized why. She looked like my mother. Before I could process it, a sound broke the silence. A soft thud, coming from upstairs. My heart pounded as I made my way up the creaking staircase, each step threatening to give way beneath me. At the top, a long hallway stretched out, the doors on either side hanging open. "Eliza?" I called again. This time there was a response, a faint, trembling voice. "In here." The voice came from the last door on the right. I pushed it open to find a small bedroom, the wallpaper peeling and the floor littered with debris. In the corner, an old woman sat in a rocking chair, her frail hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You came," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're Eliza?" I asked, stepping closer. She nodded, her eyes misty and distant. "I've been waiting for you. I promised your mother I'd tell you the truth, but only when the time was right." "The truth about what?" She gestured toward a small chest on the floor. "Everything you need to know is in there." I hesitated before kneeling to open it. Inside were stacks of letters, faded photographs, and a leather-bound journal. As I flipped through them, a horrifying story began to emerge. My family had lived in Ashfall generations ago, but they'd been forced to flee after a series of mysterious disappearances were linked to them. The Granger house had been the epicenter of the town's fear, and my mother had been one of the last to leave. "What happened here?" I asked, my voice shaking. Eliza's expression darkened. "Your family was cursed. Something in these woods, something old and hungry. It marked your bloodline. Your mother thought she could escape it, but no one ever does." Before I could respond, a low, guttural growl rumbled from somewhere outside. Eliza's eyes widened in terror. "It's here," she whispered. The next moments were a blur. The window shattered as something massive and shadowy burst into the room. Eliza screamed, and I felt myself being dragged backward, the journal still clutched in my hands. When I woke, I was lying in the woods, the journal beside me. The house was gone, replaced by a charred patch of earth. I don't know how I survived or what really happened that night, but I left Ashfall and never looked back. The journal sits on my shelf, a grim reminder of the secrets my family tried to bury and the darkness that still haunts me. The cold wind bit at my face as I made my way down the nearly deserted street. My shift at the diner had stretched long past midnight, leaving me bone-tired and irritable. The city was quieter than usual, with only the occasional flicker of headlights or distant echo of footsteps to remind me that I wasn't entirely alone. My phone had died hours earlier, leaving me without music or a sense of security. The only sound was the rhythmic crunch of gravel under my worn sneakers as I trudged forward, wishing for the warmth of my apartment. Normally I'd take the bus, but the last one had left over an hour ago, thanks to the city's holiday schedule. That left me with no choice but to walk the 2 miles home. My usual route felt unnecessarily long tonight, so I opted for a shortcut, a narrow alley that sliced through an industrial section of the neighborhood. I had taken it once before during the day and remembered it shaved off at least 15 minutes. It was risky, sure, but all I could think about was getting home. As I turned into the alley, the tall, weathered buildings on either side seemed to close in, their windows dark and lifeless. The air smelled faintly of rust and oil, and puddles from an earlier rainstorm glistened under the weak glow of a distant street lamp. My steps echoed unnervingly loud against the brick walls, making me acutely aware of my isolation. Halfway down the alley, the feeling began. It started as a slight tingling at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. My pace slowed as I glanced over my shoulder, but the alley behind me was empty. The distant buzz of the street lamp and the occasional drip of water were the only sounds. Shaking my head, I told myself I was just being paranoid. Fatigue was messing with my head. But then I heard it. A soft scuffling sound like the scrape of a shoe against concrete. My breath caught in my throat as I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. The sound stopped too. My heart was pounding now, loud enough to drown out the faint noises of the night. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky and uncertain. Silence. I told myself to keep moving. The quicker I got out of this alley, the better. But no sooner had I started walking again than the sound returned, closer this time and unmistakable. Footsteps. They matched mine, keeping pace with each hurried step. I spun around, my breath clouding the cold air. The alley was empty, but the shadows seemed darker, deeper. My hands clenched into fists as I forced myself to keep walking. I reached the end of the alley and turned onto a quiet side street, my pace quickening as I neared the faint glow of a 24-hour convenience store. The footsteps had stopped, but the unease lingered, wrapping around me like a second skin. I burst through the store's door, the fluorescent lights momentarily blinding me. The clerk, a bored-looking man in his 30s, glanced up from his phone, startled by my sudden entrance. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone indifferent. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just needed a break from the cold." I wandered the aisles aimlessly, pretending to browse while trying to calm my racing heart. My reflection in the glass of the refrigerator doors looked pale and gaunt, my eyes wide with lingering fear. After a few minutes, I stepped back outside. The street was empty and the alley was silent, as though whatever had followed me had disappeared. I told myself I had imagined it, that I was just tired, but the knot of anxiety in my stomach didn't loosen as I hurried the rest of the way home. When I finally reached my apartment building, I was too exhausted to think about anything else. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, relief washing over me as I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. The familiar hum of the fridge and the soft creak of the floorboards felt comforting, a sharp contrast to the oppressive silence outside. I showered quickly, the hot water doing little to wash away the lingering unease. By the time I crawled into bed, my body was heavy with exhaustion, but my mind refused to quiet. Every creak of the building, every distant noise outside made me jump. Somewhere around 3 a.m. I woke with a start. At first I wasn't sure what had roused me. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the street lamp filtering through the curtains. I lay still, listening, my heart pounding in the silence. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap on my bedroom window. I froze, a cold wave of fear washing over me. My apartment was on the second floor. I told myself it was just a branch swaying in the wind or maybe a bird, but the sound came again, slow and deliberate, like someone knocking. My breath hitched as I turned toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but the faint outline of a figure was visible, silhouetted against the thin fabric. My body tensed, every instinct screaming at me to stay still, to not make a sound. The figure didn't move, just stood there, the tapping continuing in an unnerving rhythm. Summoning every ounce of courage, I reached for my phone, only to remember it was dead. The tapping stopped. For a moment there was only silence, thick and suffocating. Then I heard the faint sound of footsteps moving away from the window. I waited, my heart pounding, until I was certain the intruder was gone. Then, with shaking hands, I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a lamp, and crept toward the window. Slowly I pulled the curtain aside, peeking out. The street below was empty, as if no one had been there. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, every creak and groan of the building keeping me on edge. The next morning I found faint smudges on the window pane, as if someone had pressed their hands against the glass. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the marks, my mind racing with questions. Who had been outside my window and why? For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I walked home late, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, the memory of that tapping sound haunting me. I never used the shortcut through the alley again, and I never left my curtains open at night. The city had always been quiet, like a secret whispered between the hills. Growing up here, I never felt unsafe, not once. Doors were left unlocked. Children played outside until the last light of the day faded, and people greeted each other with easy smiles. It was the kind of place that lulled you into thinking nothing bad could ever happen. That belief shattered for me one frigid night in December. I was coming back from a long photography gig, a wedding that stretched from the golden afternoon into the early hours of the next day. My gear was stowed neatly in the back seat, but my shoulders still carried the weight of the day's work. The laughter and music of the celebration had long faded from my mind, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. The roads were deserted. A low mist hovered over the ground, blurring the edges of the familiar streets. The only sound was the soft hum of my car's engine, steady and comforting against the stillness of the night. My parents' house, built into the hillside with its cluster of neatly attached homes, was just minutes away. I let out a long sigh, the thought of my warm bed pulling me forward like a magnet. As I approached the parking area, nestled beneath the houses like a hidden enclave, my headlights swept over the row of cars. Everything looked as it always did, silent, orderly, untouched by the chaos of the world beyond our little valley. But then, something moved. At first I thought it was an animal, a stray cat perhaps, or a raccoon scavenging for scraps. But as my headlights caught the figure more clearly, a chill crept up my spine. It was a man. He moved between the cars with an unsettling purpose, his hands testing door handles, his head swiveling as though he was searching for something or someone. My heart began to pound, a cold dread settling over me. This wasn't right. I parked the car a few spots away, leaving the engine running as I tried to decide what to do. My first instinct was to call the police, but some stubborn part of me resisted. This was my home, my neighborhood. I didn't want to believe that something sinister could happen here. Taking a deep breath, I turned off the engine and stepped out into the cold night air. The chill bit into my skin, making my breath visible in small, ghostly puffs. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing louder than I intended. The man froze. Slowly he turned to look at me, and for a moment I wished I hadn't said anything. His eyes were wide and glassy, the pupils so dilated that they seemed to swallow the light. His face was gaunt, the kind of thinness that spoke of neglect or something worse. He was dressed in nothing but a pair of shorts and a thin t-shirt, completely inappropriate for the freezing weather. "What are you doing here?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. For a moment, he just stared at me, as if he was trying to process the question. Then, he started walking toward me. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to get back in the car and drive away. But I stood my ground, my feet rooted to the pavement as he approached. "What's up?" he said, his voice rough and shaky. He was close now, close enough that I could see the faint tremor in his hands, the nervous energy that seemed to buzz beneath his skin. Everything about him felt wrong, like a distorted reflection of a normal person. "You shouldn't be here," I said firmly. "Go home." He tilted his head, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he didn't move. Then, without a word, he turned and started walking away, crossing the road toward the houses opposite ours. I exhaled shakily, relief flooding through me, but as I watched him, my relief turned to unease. He didn't leave. Instead, he began moving between the houses, peering into windows, testing door handles just as he had with the cars. My hands were trembling as I pulled out my phone. Dialing the police felt surreal, like something I'd only ever seen in movies or read about in the news. The operator's voice was calm and professional, a stark contrast to the anxiety that churned inside me. "There's a man acting suspiciously in our parking area," I said, my voice shaking. "He's checking cars, and now he's near the houses across the street. I think he's looking for something or trying to break in." The operator assured me that officers were on their way, and I hung up, my eyes never leaving the man. Minutes crawled by as I stood there, hidden in the shadows. Every so often the man would glance over his shoulder, and I would duck further into the darkness, my pulse pounding in my ears. Finally, the sound of a car engine broke the oppressive silence. Red and blue lights flickered against the houses as the police arrived, their presence both a relief and a new source of tension. The man froze, his body stiffening as the patrol car pulled up beside him, but he didn't run. Instead, he stood there, watching the officers with an unsettling calm. The police approached him cautiously, their hands resting on their belts. They asked him for identification, but he remained silent, his wide eyes locked onto theirs. When they moved to handcuff him, he didn't resist. He allowed himself to be led to the patrol car as though he had been expecting this all along. As the car drove away, taking the man with it, the silence returned. I stood there for a long time, my breath visible in the cold night air. The relief I expected didn't come. Instead, I felt a lingering unease, a crack in the sense of safety that had always defined this place. Even after locking the door behind me that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I didn't sleep well. The image of his wide, glassy eyes stayed with me, haunting the edges of my thoughts. And though the police later assured me that he was likely just a drifter, someone looking for easy targets, I couldn't shake the sense that it had been something more. This place, my sanctuary, felt different now, vulnerable. Because sometimes safety is just an illusion. It was a cold night in Hollywood, the kind of cold that crept under your skin and made the vibrant city feel like a hollow, forgotten shell. The streets, usually buzzing with lights and noise, were eerily quiet. It was almost 2 a.m. as I navigated the darkened roads, heading home after an exhausting shift at the restaurant where I worked as a manager. My colleague had called in sick, leaving me to close up alone, and now I was desperate for the solace of my bed. Turning onto Kena Boulevard, I noticed how the dim streetlights cast distorted, ghostly shadows on the cracked asphalt. The buildings loomed tall and foreboding, their dark windows like vacant eyes. The air was thick with an unplaceable tension, a weight that settled on my chest as if the city itself were holding its breath. I brushed it off, attributing my unease to the fatigue that clouded my thoughts. As I approached a stop sign, the tension in the air thickened. My headlights cut through the shadows, illuminating the empty crosswalk ahead. My car's hum was the only sound breaking the stillness. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. Emerging from the darkness on both sides of the street were men, 5, maybe 6, their faces obscured by shadows. They moved slowly, almost too casually, as if they had been lying in wait. The sight of them sent a shiver racing down my spine. Their gait was predatory, deliberate, as they fanned out to block my path. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, and my heart pounded in my chest. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind, but I forced myself to stay calm. As they stepped into the crosswalk, the dim light revealed their faces, hardened expressions, eyes that glinted with malice. Instinct screamed at me to act. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas. My car lurched forward, the tires screeching against the pavement. The men's expressions twisted into rage as they realized my intention. A couple of them lunged toward my car, their hands slamming against the hood as I sped through the intersection. In the rearview mirror, I saw them running after me, but I didn't look back for long. I couldn't. All I could do was focus on getting as far away as possible. Adrenaline coursed through me as I navigated the empty streets. My heart raced and my hands trembled against the steering wheel. Only when I was several blocks away did I dare to slow down. Glancing in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see the men chasing me, but the streets behind me were empty. It was as if they had vanished into the night, leaving behind only the echo of their pounding footsteps in my memory. I pulled over in a well-lit parking lot, my chest heaving as I tried to calm down. The silence around me felt oppressive, a stark contrast to the chaos I had just escaped. My mind raced with questions. Who were those men? What did they want? Deep down, I knew the answers were far darker than I cared to consider. My hands were still shaking as I restarted the engine and drove home, every shadow and passing car filling me with dread. When I finally locked the door behind me, my apartment felt like a fragile sanctuary. I double-checked the locks, peering through the peephole to ensure no one had followed me. The night stretched on, but sleep eluded me. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind against the window pane made my heart leap. I couldn't shake the image of their faces, the cold malice in their eyes. The following days passed uneventfully, but the memory of that night lingered like a shadow. I avoided Cana Boulevard entirely, choosing longer routes to and from work. Yet no matter how much distance I put between myself and that intersection, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. It was subtle at first. A passing figure in the periphery, a car parked a little too long outside my building. I convinced myself it was paranoia. But then the calls started. It began with a single innocuous ring late one night. The caller ID showed unknown. I ignored it, but the calls persisted over the next few days, each one coming at increasingly odd hours. Finally, fed up, I answered. "Hello?" My voice was sharp, edged with frustration. For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. Then a low, raspy voice whispered, "You shouldn't have run." My blood turned to ice. I hung up immediately, my hands trembling. My mind raced, searching for an explanation. Was this some cruel prank? Had someone followed me that night? The calls continued sporadically, each one more unsettling than the last. Sometimes there was heavy breathing. Other times, the voice would mutter incoherent phrases. Once I thought I heard faint laughter in the background. Desperate for answers, I reported the incidents to the police. The officer I spoke to was sympathetic but offered little reassurance. "It's hard to trace calls like these," he said, handing me a card with a hotline number. "Let us know if anything escalates." Escalated did. One night I returned home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My heart sank as I pushed it open, the hinges creaking ominously. The living room was in disarray, drawers pulled out, cushions thrown to the floor. It wasn't just a break-in, it was a message. On the wall, scrawled in what looked like charcoal, were the words, "We see you." I stumbled back, the room spinning around me. My first instinct was to call the police, but something stopped me. Fear, not just of whoever had been in my home, but of what they might do if I involved the authorities again. Instead, I packed a bag and left, finding refuge in a hotel on the other side of the city. But even there, the calls found me. The whispers grew more menacing, more specific. They described details of my life, things only someone watching me could know. The color of my car, the places I frequented, the name of my workplace. The sense of being hunted consumed me. The breaking point came one night when I awoke to the sound of my hotel room door handle rattling. My heart leapt into my throat as I grabbed the lamp from the bedside table, holding it like a weapon. The door didn't open, but I heard footsteps retreating down the hall. When I called the front desk, they assured me that no one had been near my room. I couldn't stay there any longer. I couldn't stay anywhere. In desperation, I reached out to a friend, Alex, someone I trusted implicitly. They listened to my story without interrupting, their expression growing graver with each detail. "You can't keep running," Alex said firmly. "Whoever these people are, they're feeding off your fear. We need to confront them." The idea terrified me, but Alex was right. I couldn't live like this, constantly looking over my shoulder. Together, we devised a plan to draw them out. That night, we returned to Kenna Boulevard. The air was just as heavy as I remembered, the streetlights casting their eerie glow. Alex parked their car nearby, staying hidden, but within reach if things went south. I stood at the intersection, my breath visible in the cold night air. For a while, nothing happened. The street was silent, the only sound my own nervous footsteps. But then, just as before, figures began to emerge from the shadows. This time, there were more of them. Their faces were partially obscured, but I recognized the same cold malice in their eyes. "You shouldn't have come back," one of them hissed, stepping closer. I stood my ground, my pulse pounding in my ears. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice shaking but resolute. The man chuckled darkly. "You took something from us. Now it's our turn." Before I could respond, Alex's car roared to life, its headlights cutting through the darkness as they drove toward the group. The men scattered like roaches, disappearing into the alleys and shadows as quickly as they had appeared. Alex jumped out, pulling me into the car. "This isn't over," they said grimly. The rest of the story unfolded like a nightmare. Each lead we followed, each piece of the puzzle we uncovered, revealed a sinister truth about the men and their motives. They weren't just random criminals. They were part of something much darker, a network that thrived on fear and control. But Alex and I were determined to fight back. Piece by piece, we dismantled their grip, exposing their operations to the authorities and the public. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without sacrifice. The scars of that time remain with me, a constant reminder of how close I came to losing everything. Even now, years later, I avoid Kenna Boulevard. But I've learned to live without fear, knowing that sometimes the only way to escape the darkness is to face it head on.